Hi, good afternoon if you're on the East Coast, or good morning if you're on the West Coast. My name is Aaron Lacey. I'm a partner in the higher education practice here at Thompson Coburn, and you are listening to the third in our five-part series, Navigating Gainful Employment. This particular session is titled Completers List Challenges, Debt Challenges, and Alternative Earnings Appeals. This is actually an updated recording. If you were one of the folks who actually listened to the original recording, which was done in February 2016, this is March 2016, we decided to re-record this particular session to improve the recording quality. We had some technical issues with the original recording, but rest assured that all of the content is the same. One note, if you are listening to this at some later date, it is March 2016 when we're making this recording. Please keep in mind if several months have passed that law and guidance can change. So please take that into account as you're sort of going through the slides and thinking about where things are in any given point of time. I mentioned a moment ago, my name's Aaron Lacey. I'm a member of the higher ed practice here at Thompson Coburn. We're a law firm. We're based in St. Louis and have offices in other parts of the country as well, Washington, D.C., Chicago, L.A., places like that. Our higher education practice does a lot of things. I like to group them sort of in three buckets. We provide regulatory counsel on federal, state, and accrediting agency laws and standards that apply to higher education, so the federal financial aid programs, Title IV, Title IX, Clery Act, consumer information requirements, things like that, like gainful employment, of course. We assist folks with a wide variety of post-secondary transactions, so that can include commercial contracts, services agreements, drafting and negotiation, policy creation, and compliance systems design. And we also do merger and acquisition work for both for-profits and nonprofits when you have larger transactions of that nature. And finally, we represent institutions in student and employee litigation and also in administrative contexts, so government investigations, administrative proceedings, for example, a program review with the Department of Education, something along those lines. Just so you know a little bit about me, before I was with Thompson & Coburn, I was the Senior Vice President of Regulatory Affairs and Strategic Development, that's a mouthful, for a post-secondary institution with many locations and an online division. So I had experience from the in-house perspective for several years and was actually in-house when the original gainful employment rules came out. And the institution I was with had a number of gainful employment programs, and so we went through all the reporting requirements and those types of things under the original 2011 framework. Before that, I was in a law firm in Washington, D.C. In their higher education practice for many years as well. Here's the overall schedule for the series. As I mentioned, it's 5 parts. We are right in the heart with this presentation, and all of these, if you're listening to this now, presumably you're on our webpage where we've listed each presentation, so they're all available on demand for you to listen to at your convenience. We know these rules are complicated and can be difficult to wrap the brain around, so we've tried to, that's why we've created all this content, because we think it may be helpful for folks. Here's today's presentation outline. The first is the GE timeline, which we do at the beginning of every one of the webinars in this series. Then I'm going to do a brief debt-to-earnings rate refresher, which is important to understand and remember how the rates are actually set up and calculated before you get into the various challenges, because, as you would expect, they involve challenging components of those rates. We're going to talk about specifically here in the heart of the order, the completers list challenges, the loan debt challenge, and the alternative earnings appeal. Those are the 3 big opportunities this year and on an ongoing basis institutions will have to take a cut at the calculations that the department presents. And then finally, we'll very briefly discuss some GE resources. So the gainful employment timeline, this is 2015, so this is all stuff that's already happened. You'll recall that July 1 of last year, the new gainful employment regulations became effective, and then on July 31st and October 1st, respectively, institutions reported many years' worth of award year data for each of their gainful employment programs. In November, for the first time, schools had the opportunity to register and still can register as of right now for the SEIG enrollment website to set up a gainful employment mailbox there and also to enroll in the department's new data challenges and appeals or DCAS service. I'm going to talk about both of those things extensively today in the context of the completers list challenge discussion, so we'll just move through it right now and then come back to it a little later. And then December 31 of last year was the deadline to complete your GE transitional certification if you had a GE program. So if you're offering any gainful employment programs, whether you're a for-profit institution, a nonprofit institution, you were required by December 31 of last year to do a transitional certification. The only reason you wouldn't have had to do that is if you were already involved in some other approval process with the department and they just wrapped the certification in with it. So for the vast majority of schools, this was something they needed to do. If you have not yet done it, then I encourage you to do it as soon as possible. My expectation is by this point you've probably heard from the department, but if for some reason you have not and you don't recall doing this, you want to take the time. It's not that hard to do. It shouldn't take that long, and you can find information on how to complete the certification on the Department of Education's Gainful Employment website, and we provide a link to that in the GE resources section here at the end. So this year, 2016, the story of this year are these challenges: the completers list challenge, the draft loan debt challenge, and then the alternative earnings appeal. And respectively, we expect these things that come about and the challenge opportunities to present themselves in the spring, in the summer, and the fall, although, as I will discuss later, the timeline for all of this is getting pushed back right now. So again, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because this is what we're really talking about in today's webinar, are these challenge opportunities. But at least as of right now, we still expect all of them to present themselves to institutions this year. So prior to the end, they may get squished into the middle and the second half of this year, but we still expect all of them to be available before year's end. Next year, in January, the new GE disclosures become effective. The regulations, I should say, requiring the new type of GE disclosures become effective. We discussed the GE disclosures in great detail in the final or the fifth webinar in this 5-part series. So if you're interested in learning more about that, please listen to that webinar. But the one thing I emphasize there, and I'll emphasize here as well, is the challenges all must occur sequentially, those things I was talking about on the prior slide. So if the completers list process gets backed up, right, then you're going to see the loan debt challenge and then the alternative earnings appeal, all of that get backed up on the calendar, right, because they have to happen in a certain order. The new disclosure requirements operate independent of that whole challenge process. And the point here I'm trying to make is they're going to go into effect January 1, 2017, even if all the challenge stuff is getting backed up and taking a really long time, because that's in the regulations. As a matter of law, the new GE disclosure requirements become effective January 1, 2017. The only reason those would be delayed is if the department put out some sort of guidance between now and then saying we're going to delay enforcement of these new requirements because of X, Y, or Z, right? But the law becomes effective, so you need to be ready come January 1, 2017 to comply with those new disclosure requirements. Also in 2017, originally we thought it would be winter. Now it's looking more like spring. At some point, the department is expected to release the final, first round, final debt to earnings rates. But that is going to be affected by whether or not these challenge processes get backed up. So if all that stuff moves further and further down into 2016, it's possible that you will not see final rates for the first time until well into the spring of 2017 or conceivably even later. So let's do a quick rate refresher. You know, we're talking about the debt to earnings rates at length today. It's really good then to have a good, strong sense of what those rates are. There are two. There is the annual earnings rate and the discretionary income rate. And these are the two rates that the department's going to calculate for each one of your gainful employment programs. You'll note that the numerator is identical for both of these rates, annual loan payment. The denominator is different, although I will tell you the discretionary income that you see in the denominator there of the second rate, discretionary income rate, is very similar to annual earnings. It's just a slight variation of annual earnings. So once you have your annual loan payment, if you were trying to project rates for programs, for example, you would have the numerator for both equations. And once you have the annual earnings for your program, you would really only need to do a very small calculation to come up with discretionary income for that program. Here are this is the pass zone fail chart. It's been in just about every one of our presentations. So the department will calculate those two rates for each one of your GE programs, and then they will determine whether or not that program for that given year passes is in the zone or fails. And I won't go through these. I've gone through it in detail in prior presentations, but you can take time to look at these and see what the various thresholds are. The one point I will make is that you have to fail both the annual earnings rate and the discretionary income rate for the program to fail for a given year. So if either your AER or your DIR is in the zone or passes, then your program is in the zone or passes, right? You have to fail both to fail. So there's a distinction between failing and becoming ineligible. A GE program becomes ineligible if the program fails 2 out of any 3 consecutive award years for which rates are calculated. So even if you fail in year 1, let's say those final rates come out in spring of 2017 and your program has failed, you don't automatically lose eligibility. You would have to fail the next year, or if you pass the next year and then fail the year after that, then you would lose eligibility. It has to be 2 out of 3 consecutive years for which rates are calculated. I emphasize that for which rates are calculated. If you don't have a certain number of students in your student cohort, and we talk about this at length in the first couple of sessions in this series when we get into how rates are calculated and cohorts are determined and all those kinds of things. But if you don't have a certain threshold of students, then the department won't calculate rates for you for a given year. If that happens, they consider that a no result. That doesn't mean you pass. It's as if that year has evaporated. So let me give you an example. If you passed in year 1 and then you failed in year 2, right, and then you had a year where you had no result, and then you failed again in year 4, right, then you would fail because you would have failed 2 out of 3 consecutive years, right? You passed year 1, then you had a fail, and then a no result year and another fail. The no result year sort of evaporates. Like I said, it's as if it's not even there for purposes of this determination. So then you have those 3 consecutive years and you fail 2 out of the 3. So you see how that works. The other sanction that is attached to this whole debt to earnings rate calculation is this student warning sanction, and it does come into play if you only fail a single year. So institutions have to make student warnings to students, these specific warnings, if there is a possibility that the GE program will lose its financial aid eligibility within a year or the next year, right? So if you fail in year 1, if your GE program fails in year 1, then it's possible you could lose eligibility the following year if you failed again, because that would be 2 out of 3 consecutive years, right? If you're in the zone in year 1, well, then you don't have to make the student warnings, right? Because even if you failed in year 2, going in the zone and then failing, that doesn't cause you to lose eligibility. However, if you were in the zone 3 years in a row, right, then you would potentially be a year out from losing eligibility because, and you'll see here one of our sub-bullets on this slide, if an institution has a combination of zone and failing rates for 4 consecutive award years, then it can lose eligibility. But the idea is it's a consumer protection concern. What the department is saying is, look, if a program is a year out from potentially losing eligibility, then people in that program need to know, and prospective students enrolling need to know that as well. So that's why you've got to make the student warning. The student warnings are stiff. They will almost certainly impact not only your enrollment process, but your enrollment numbers. If you think you have a program that may fail in year 1, I encourage you to think seriously about how the student warning process works and how you would integrate it into your admissions process in a way that would fairly represent the warning but mitigate any unnecessary damage. Let me put it that way. We talk about the student warnings in the 4th webinar of this 5-part series. The whole webinar is about the student warnings and some thoughts about how you can integrate it into your admissions process. And I encourage schools to start thinking about that in late 2016, right? Right now, I would focus on the completers challenges and the various things we're going to talk about today, but you don't want to be caught off guard in early 2017. In fall, winter of this year, you want to start thinking about these student warnings if you think you've got a program that's going to fail in year 1, so that when you get that letter from the department saying your program has failed and you have 30 days to start making that student warning, you're ready to go, right? You're not scrambling. So what if you disagree with the department's debt-to-earning challenges, or sorry, with the department's debt-to-earning calculations? You will have 2 opportunities to challenge the numbers before the final rates are issued, and that's the completer list challenge and the loan debt challenge. and then you will have one opportunity to challenge the DE rates after the final rates are issued, and that's the alternative earnings appeal. So in this sense, it's a little bit like the cohort default rate challenges, right? You recall when you have cohort default rate you don't like, there are certain ways you can challenge the draft rates, and then once the final rates are issued, some of those opportunities go away, and you have different ways that you can go about challenging the final cohort default rate. Similarly, you have different types of challenges available to you here depending on where you are in the process. So let's talk about the first in this list, sequentially, the completers list challenge. What is a completers list challenge? So for each gainful employment program, the department's going to create a list of students who completed the program during the applicable cohort period, and they're going to provide that list to institutions for you to review. What do I mean by that, a list of students? So when they do these rates, remember, fundamentally what we're comparing is we're comparing debt that was taken on by a group of students, right, to the earnings that were made by that group of students when they graduated. And so a critical piece of this is, well, who are the students? What's the right grouping? So you supplied all this information to the department in the fall of each year, and they're going to crunch all that information, and part of what you've told them is these are the folks who graduated or completed our program during the applicable cohort. So this is the right group of students, and they're going to crunch the numbers, and they're going to look at that, and they're going to send that list back to you, and they're going to say, okay, we understand that this is the group of students that completed your program during the applicable cohort period. And so it's this group for which we're going to take debt information and for which we're going to take salary or earnings information, and that's what and how we're going to go about calculating your DE rates. So you're going to get a chance to review and challenge that list and either say, hey, you know what, we think that there are students that are on this list that shouldn't be on the list, or we think that there are folks who should be on the list and for some reason they aren't. So you can challenge that list. The department presumes the list is accurate, as you would expect. And remember, it is based on data you provided them in the prior fall. So they're saying, well, look, you gave us the data and we crunched it and we presume that the list we come back with is accurate. But institutions will have an opportunity to challenge. They're just going to have to be able to overcome that presumption. And what that means is you're going to have to provide documentation or evidence supporting why you think that this student should or should not be included on the list. So what kind of data would you challenge? Think of it in sort of two buckets, right? The first is just outright data errors. And the department has actually said the completers list challenge is the last opportunity institutions have to fix the data they sent in the fall of the prior year. So if you know if between October 1 when you submitted that data and when you get your completers list, you figure out that you made a reporting mistake and either you included students that you shouldn't have or the withdrawal dates were all wrong, or if any data point associated with those students that you submitted the prior fall you figure out is wrong, this is your chance to fix it. It also is your last chance to fix it. So you want to take advantage of the completers list process, not only to think about, specifically who's on this list and whether we like that information and whether we think that there should be folks who should be included or excluded, but also just did we make a data error in the fall that we need to fix at this point, okay? Data errors, again, could include, I said anything associated with that student just to sort of get your mind working and thinking about what that might mean. Student identity, so their name, their date of birth, information about the program the student was in. Is the zip code right? Is the credential level right? Is their attendance information right? Dates of enrollment, enrollment status, and is their financial aid information right? So you reported tuition fees, book supplies, private loan debt, institutional debt, all this stuff for that student. And this is your chance to say, hey, you know what, we made a mistake and we just need to fix it. The other thing, the other bucket, the second bucket, that really goes to whether students should be on or off the list entirely, is this exclusions bucket. So not only is the department saying this is the group of folks that we think completed the program during the applicable period, but they're also saying, and we think they are all qualifying, what I'll call qualifying gainful employment students, because even if you have someone who completed your program in the right time frame, it's possible they might be excluded from your cohort for various reasons, and these are the reasons why. So if they didn't receive any Title IV, remember, under the new gainful employment regulations for 2014, and this is a big difference from the old construct, the 2011 regulations. In 2014, under the current new gainful employment regulations, in all respects, we are only concerned with folks who got some form of Title IV, right? So in the old days, under the 2011 regs, all the different equations and everything, factored in anyone who completed a gainful employment program, whether they got Title IV or not. That is no longer the case. Now, when you report information in the fall, it's only students who got some form of Title IV. When the department calculates your DE rates, it's only students who got some form of Title IV, right? When you're making all those disclosures and the department comes up with completion rates and placement rates, and we talk about all that in the last of our 5-part series here, when you get in the new 2017 disclosures, only students who got some form of Title IV. Now, that doesn't mean loans, by the way. That could mean a Pell Grant. So if you had someone who just got a Pell Grant, they would still be included, even though they didn't have any Title IV loan debt. But they have to have received some form of Title IV. There are several other criteria they also have to meet. Or criteria that if they are true, the result would be they would be excluded. So certainly if they didn't complete during the cohort period, they would be excluded. And that's just really a data point you always want to check and make sure is accurate. If they were on a military deferment during the earnings period, if they sought for and received a military deferment during the earnings period, if they sought and received some sort of permanent disability status during the earnings period, if they were enrolled in another school or enrolled in another program at your school during the earnings period, or if they were deceased, right? If any of those things are true, and I skipped one here and I'll come back to it, but if any of those things are true, then they would be excluded. And you say, well, Aaron, why is that? Well, here's what the department has recognized. They recognize that if you educated a student, right, and let's say for the first 14-15 award year, the appropriate two-year cohort is 10, 11, 11, 12. So let's say you had a student who completed in 10, 11, 11, 12, right? But then they immediately went into the military, and they were in the military and continue to be in the military, right up until this point in time. Remember, when the department does these equations, they're going to be taking, for the folks who completed in the applicable cohort period, 10, 11, 11, 12, they're going to be looking at the earnings those folks accumulated, or what was their earnings in calendar year 14. And what the department is acknowledging is that if someone went into the military, then they probably weren't doing whatever it is you prepared them to do in your program, so they weren't making money or earnings that are representative of graduates of your program. So they're going to exclude them from the cohort. Same reason with permanent disability. If someone was permanently disabled in 2014, again, they're not a fair representation of what your graduates are making. If they were in school in 2014, either at your school or another school, once again, and of course, if they were deceased during 2014, they weren't making any money, and it would be unfair to include them in your cohort because they're going to have zero earnings. So the department recognizes, and this is if you do placement rate work at your school or, folks who do, similarly, that a lot of accrediting agencies and others won't hold you accountable for a student who is, for example, deceased, because obviously it's very difficult to place a student who has passed away. For the same reason here, the department has said, look, if one of these things is true, we're not going to include them in the cohort because we appreciate that they're not making money, or the money that they were making in calendar year 14 is not representative. Now, you may be thinking to yourself right now, how will the department know whether these things are true, and how do I find out if these things are true? The answer is they may not. And the answer also is you may not. And the department acknowledged that in the preamble to the final regulations. They said, look, if someone has applied to us for a military deferment, or if they've applied to us to adjust their financial aid, if we found out that they were deceased because something came in so that their loans would be canceled, then we'll know. But it's entirely conceivable, and the department has acknowledged this, that we may not know one of these things is true, right? I mean, you could have someone who went and enrolled at another institution and didn't seek any Title IV. Right, or maybe the information just didn't get processed correctly or get to the department. So this is absolutely an opportunity, and the department has acknowledged that it is, for an institution to say, hey, department, you've missed a data point here, but we know, because we know that Nancy, who graduated 2 years ago, is now enrolled at another school or is in another one of our programs, that she would fit into this exclusion and should be excluded from the cohort. And that's what the department is saying as part of the Completers List Challenge process is, institution, we presume these lists are correct, but if institutions can show us, document that, for example, a student hits one of these exclusions, then they should be pulled out of the cohort appropriately. And these are all in the law. These exclusions are written into the law. The other one is if the student completed a higher credentialed program. We talk about at length in I think the first and probably the second webinar in this series. The department has a loan debt roll-up concept. So if you have, let's say you offer a certificate program in medical assisting, right? And you also offer an associate degree in medical assisting, and they're built so that they flow into one another. The certificate program transfers entirely into the associate degree program, and you've got lots of students that they enroll in the certificate program initially, but then they stay enrolled and move right into the associate degree program and get the associate degree. So let's say that's very common. Then what the way that the law works is if they actually completed that associate degree prior to the point at which you're calculating these rates. So let's say they finished the certificate in 11-12, but then they went on into the associate degree and finished the associate degree in 2014, right? So well before the end of the 14-15 award year and before the point at which these rates are being calculated. Then the way the law works is that student is excluded from the cohort for the certificate degree program and is included in the cohort for the associate degree program. And all the debt and cost information, everything that's associated with the certificate part is rolled into the associate degree part. So that student's going to be part of your associate degree cohort, and all the debt and earnings calculations and everything will be tied to the associate degree program, and they will be excluded entirely from the certificate program. So, again, if you have a student that fits that profile and they show up on your completers list that the department sends you for your certificate program, this would be an opportunity for you to say, hey, wait a minute, this student shouldn't be included because they went on and completed a higher credential program at our institution. Couple of things I'll point out. It has to be a higher credential program. So if you had a student that completed that certificate in medical assisting and then went and completed subsequently a certificate in HVAC, the student will be included in both of those cohorts because the HVAC program is a subsequent program, but it's not at a higher credential level. They're at the same credential level. So the student will just show up in both, and the debt and earnings information and all that stuff will just be dropped into the appropriate bucket, once for the medical assistant certificate and once for the HVAC certificate. The other thing I'll point out is if you do meet the higher credential criteria, it doesn't matter if they were different programs. So let's say they finished a certificate in medical assisting and then went on and completed an associate degree in HVAC. The debt is still rolled up, even though those programs are completely dissimilar. There's no sort of requirement that one program lead into another or that they be in the same subject matter. The fact remains that you had a student who would have completed a higher credential program prior to the point at which the rates were being calculated for 14-15. So all the debt would still be rolled up, even though they were totally different subjects. The final thing I'll note is the department draws a hard line between undergraduate and graduate programs when it does its debt roll-up. So if you have a student who, if you're a for-profit institution, this wouldn't apply to nonprofits, but if you are a for-profit that has a bachelor's degree offering and also a master's degree offering, for example. By the way, the reason it wouldn't apply to nonprofits is because degree programs offered by nonprofits are not gainful employment programs, but at for-profits they all are. So if you're a for-profit and you're offering a bachelor's degree gainful employment program and a student completed that program and then went on to complete a master's degree gainful employment program, right, before the point at which the rates were calculated, you would not roll the debt up into the master's degree because the department draws this hard line between undergraduate and graduate. So you roll all the debt up to the highest level undergraduate program they completed at your institution, and then you roll all the debt up to the highest level graduate program that they completed at your institution. But the undergrad and grad stuff are always separate, and that includes grad certificates, masters, doctors, first professional degrees on the graduate side of the fence. So where do you get a completers list? The department is going to generate and send the draft completers list to schools' designated SAIG mailbox. What that means is you need to go designate an SAIG mailbox for GE purposes so that you can receive this information. The department said they will also post an electronic announcement when they distribute the completers list, and there will be an alternative way if you don't set up that mailbox that you can go retrieve it. But here's the thing, and I'll mention this in a couple of slides. Once those lists are distributed, the clock starts ticking as to how much time you have to put in your challenge. So if you don't register to receive the list through your SAIG mailbox, right, and you're not paying attention and you don't see that electronic announcement, you know, a couple of weeks could go by before you figure out that the completers lists have been distributed. Now, you can still go get it, but at that point, you've dramatically reduced the amount of time you have to put in your completers list challenge. So you want to do what you need to do to make sure that as soon as those things are distributed, you get them right away. And the two things I would suggest is, one, right now, go to FSA web enroll. It's really easy to do, and designate an SAIG mailbox for GE purposes, and that's how you'll get the completers list. The other thing is, if you're not already set up with My IFAP on the department's IFAP website, and most of you in financial aid almost certainly will be, but you can go to the IFAP website, and on the left-hand side there's a column, and you can create an account and do My IFAP, and you can set it up so that whenever there are electronic announcements, dear colleagues, calendar announcements, anything like that, they send it to you, and it shows up in your email box. I highly recommend that you do that. That way you've got two ways. One is just monitoring your SAIG mailbox, but also you've got an email coming to you every day or every week, depending on how you set up your My IFAP account, and it tells you, hey, there's a new electronic announcement. Just like when cohort default rates or drafts and finals are released, you'll get an announcement, and it'll say, hey, the completers lists have been released. All right. So when do I get my completers list? The million-dollar question. Initially, the department intended to do this in December 2015, and they had put out an announcement that said, hey, we're going to put this out, and in November they did a couple of webinars, et cetera, and then they created a beta group, which, by the way, I think is great, and I give props, kudos, depending on your generation, to the department for using this beta group model. I think it was a great idea, and I'm very appreciative that they did that. I think it's good for schools and, frankly, good for the department and everybody else as well that's involved. But what happened was, so they put together this beta group, and the beta group consisted of representative schools from various different sectors. So they had a public institution and a big private for-profit and a small cosmetology for-profit and a private nonprofit, and, you know, someone from sort of each category and of differing sizes. And they pushed out a beta version of the completers list and asked for feedback. And I know this because I've been fortunate enough to have a couple of very long conversations with one of the gentlemen at one of the institutions that participated in the beta group. And my understanding is that the feedback was pretty significant, that the folks who participated in the beta group came back to the department and said, look, respectfully, this is very difficult. There are lots of things here that don't make sense. There are lots of things that are hard for us to get our minds around. If you're a school that's not large and doesn't have a qualified IT staff that can manage all of this stuff, you're at a significant disadvantage. Because one of the things I'll note, and you'll see this if you go watch the November webinars that the department put out on completers list, you know, they're pushing out these very large text files, right? So if you've ever done any work with text files or you're in database management, you know, you get this whole series of text files, and you got a header file and a footer file and all these things in between. And the best and most efficient way to manage all of this data is if you have some sort of database software like Access or something like that, and you pull all this stuff in and you sort it and everything. But for a lot of us, that's very challenging. And even if you're a large institution, the folks who know something about gainful employment and the folks who know something about databases may be miles apart, literally on campus, and figuratively in terms of how often they work together and how these systems are integrated, et cetera. So all of the beta group folks, for the most part, came back and said, look, there are just a lot of challenges here. We think this could be much simpler, and we really encourage the department to go back and try to put a lot of fixes into place. So the department did that. What I don't know now, and I mentioned at the top of the presentation that it is now March 23rd when I'm doing this re-recording. I spoke with the folks in the beta group again yesterday. And my understanding is as of March 23rd, 2016, they still don't know if the department intends to do another distribution to the beta group for a second round of feedback, or if the department intends to simply try to package all this stuff, take the feedback and make the tweaks, and then distribute to the full higher ed community, essentially going live. The person I spoke with, his opinion was it would be much wiser if the department did a second round with the beta group, and he would be very surprised if they just went directly to the live distribution. But who knows? He also noted that he had not actually heard anything from the department. The interesting thing is, though, I mean, originally they were going to do this in December, and then we heard maybe early in the year they put out an electronic announcement saying that it would be spring 2016. It's now March 23rd. You haven't even seen a second round round to the beta group, I think it's entirely feasible if they do a second round with the beta group that it could be, you know, May or even June before this thing goes live, in which case the whole calendar we're talking about today is going to be pushed out. How do I file my completers list challenge? So once the department actually pushes this information out in whatever format they ultimately decide on, and you receive it and you have a chance to look at it, right? And remember, it's not just a list of 20 students, right? I mean, it's all this data related to the student, and that's complicated and a little frustrating on the one hand. On the other hand, because they're doing it that way, it does give you another crack at correcting that data, right? If they were just sending you a list of 16 students, presumably you wouldn't have the same type of opportunity to correct all these very specific pieces of data that's associated with each student. So silver lining. Once they've actually pushed all that out, if you look at that information and you decide, you know what, I think something's wrong here, or we believe that someone should be included or excluded, or we have an update to make, how do we do that? It's going to be done through the department's new data challenges and appeal solution. I'm calling it the DCAS system. I don't know if that's how the cool kids say it or not. Maybe it'll catch on. Everybody out there that's listening, please start saying DCAS and we'll see if it catches on. Then I can take credit for coining that pronunciation. So the DCAS system that they're creating, it's a new challenge platform. Its first function is going to be for managing completers list challenges, but it's important to note that ultimately it's going to be used for all of these challenges. So not only the completers list, but the debt challenges, and then ultimately they even want to make your cohort default rate challenges. They want them to work through this system as well. So even if you're a little frustrated with the DCAS system on the front end, I think it's worth putting in the time to have at least someone or a couple people on your campus to familiarize with it, because ultimately that familiarity is going to benefit you as this becomes the go-to platform for all of the different kind of challenges that you may want to use with the department. And if you've got an internal cohort default team, you might as well start getting them involved at looking at this thing and getting up to speed, right? Because ultimately, maybe next year or 2 years out, their whole process is also going to be run through the DCAS system. Right now, a school's primary destination point administrator or your PDPA can enroll in the DCAS system. So it's not totally live, and obviously you can't lodge any challenges yet because the completers lists haven't even come out. But you can go ahead and register for using the system, and there are certain things you can play around in and familiarize with. Again, you can do that at fsawebenroll.ed.gov, and we suggest you do that right away. Why not? Additional information has also been promised from the department on the DCAS system, high-level information. They've talked about upcoming webinars and training modules and a DCAS user guide. I haven't seen any of that yet, but if you look at one of the 2 November presentations they did on completers list challenges, they talk about the DCAS system there a little bit, and I think it's the second of the 2 presentations, so you can get sort of a preview of how it works. My only concern with those November webinars is this. You know, those webinars were created when the department thought this thing was going to happen in December, and presumably lay out in detail the process that they had in place at that point in time. Having received all this pushback from the beta group, or feedback, I'll say, and understanding that they may make fairly significant revisions to elements of both the completers list distribution and the DCAS system, I would take those 2 webinars with a grain of salt. I think they're worthwhile in the sense that they give you a preview of how all this stuff is going to work, sort of at 40,000 feet, but understand there likely will be changes in the weeds with regard to the details of how these things are being done. How long do I have to file my completers list challenge? 45 days is pretty much the magic number for a lot of these challenges. So no later than 45 days after the department issues the completers list, not after you receive it, but after they issue the completers list. You have to provide evidence showing that your student should be included or removed or correct the data, right? And after that 45-day period expires, you no longer have any opportunity to modify that list. So again, this is why it's important to make sure you've got systems in place so that you will know the day it comes out and you can jump on it and start reviewing it as soon as possible. What results from a completers list challenge? What you would expect. So the department will look at the evidence and they'll either accept your corrections and notify you as to whether or not they've accepted or rejected. If they do accept and they make revisions, then they will use that revised completers list, and that's what they'll use to calculate the debt. And importantly, that's what goes to Social Security Administration. So before the department ever requests any earnings information, right, I mean, they're going to give you this completers list, and you guys are going to go over it, and you're going to have a shot at correcting it. And so that's an important note. One interesting point I just want to highlight here at the bottom of this slide, the institution is responsible for updating the data in NSLDS so that the correct data is used in subsequent GE calculations and GE disclosures. So let me be clear as to what I understand that to mean. I understand that to mean that you put in your challenge, the DCAS system, and then the department comes back and says, okay, we accept this data should be changed. We accept that the completers list should be changed. But then you, the institution, actually have to go in and correct the data in an SLDS to reflect the changes that the department approved. And if you don't, then subsequent GE calculations done by the department and the GE disclosures you have to make, which will include those calculations done by the department, could be inaccurate, right? This seems odd to me that it would fall on the institutions. You would think that if the department is working through this and approving this, then on their end the changes would be made. But just note that that does not appear to be the case. Maybe we'll get more guidance on this down the line. I understand this is one of the things that the beta group sort of express bewilderment over. You know, it makes you wonder, well, what happens if the institution fails to do it, or if the institution goes in to correct things and doesn't do it correctly? Are they then held accountable? I mean, what if that has consequences down the line? It's very interesting to me that currently this is how it's being planned. So keep an eye out for this particular point. And if you do lodge a successful completers list challenge and the department comes back and says, yeah, we've revised the completers list, well, make sure you're thinking about what extra needs to be done to make sure that all the right data is where it needs to be. All right, here are all the resources for the completers list. You'll see I've sort of put them out chronologically. Most of them were put out in October, November, late last year, December. If you look on the web page where this recording is available, there should be an electronic version next to it, a PDF electronic version of these slides, and these links are live. So if you want to get to these resources, you can go in and click on these links, and then those resources will pop up unless the links have been changed by the department. Again, you see in red the two webinars. I think they are useful, but I put them in red here just to make sure that you're remembering that they were created before the beta group process and before all the feedback, so they ostensibly are a little outdated or a lot outdated depending on the kind of changes the department makes. And then you see February 3rd is the last we heard, and at that point they just said, hey, we're pushing this out into spring, and as of March 23rd, today, the day of this recording, that continues to be the last piece of information, official information distributed by the department on the completers list process. Okay, so let's talk about loan debt challenge. We know a lot less about the loan debt challenge process because it will only occur after the completers list is done, and because right now the department is focusing entirely on just trying to get completers lists up and running. What we know about loan debt challenge then is primarily in the law itself. So what is a loan debt information challenge? When the department sends the draft rates. So after the completers list challenges are completely done, the department will then get the information from SSA, the earnings information. They've got all the stuff you've reported and it's been corrected, and then they're going to run the numbers, and they're going to issue to the institution draft DE rates, just like they issue draft CDR rates. And when they do that, they're going to send to you for each individual, so for each student in the cohort, the loan debt information that they have. And you're going to have an opportunity to challenge that. Now, again, the department presumes that loan debt information is accurate. And so if you're going to challenge it to be successful, you're going to have to provide documentation and support for why the information that they have should be changed. What might you challenge? So, you know, and we talked about this in the first webinar in the series when we broke down the rates and got into some real detail on the elements that go into the debt calculation and the cost calculation. And then again, actually in the second webinar where we talked about strategies, we got pretty into the weeds once more on, you know, what are the different data points that go into the calculation of debt and cost for each student. Well, when you get this information back, you can think about those individual components, and those are things you can challenge. So if the actual cost information, you know, is it accurate or not? Does that match what you sent into the department, or does it look like it is appropriate for that student? Is the institutional private debt information correct? You know, Title IV debt and net adjustments is another thing. So the Title IV number that the department comes back with should be a net number. So if there were returns of Title IV to the department, that should be netted out from what was included in the Title IV debt load for a student. You'd want to make sure ostensibly that that all had been done correctly. You know, if you believe that, as we previously have discussed in this series, for each student, the department will actually take the lesser of the cost you assess the student or the debt the student took on for enrollment in that program. They could have gotten that wrong when they calculated the annual loan payment. And so if for some reason they're showing the cost number for a student and you believe that the debt number is the lesser of the two, let's say the student, they're showing your program costs $10,000, that's what you charge the student, they're showing $10,000 as the number they're going with for that student, but you know that student got a Pell Grant and didn't take out any other loans. Right? So presumably the cost number is the higher of the two numbers, right? The debt number ought to be lower, potentially zero if the student took out no debt at all, and you think that they went with the cost number erroneously, that would be something you could challenge. You could say, look, under the law, you're supposed to go with the lesser of the two numbers for each student. So that's the kind of thing you can vet. Finally, you could actually calculate, or you could run through and see if you think the department did a good job calculating the mean and median debt number for the cohort. So that would involve taking the numbers they provide for each individual student and essentially running them pursuant to the same formula to see if you came up with the same median debt number for the cohort that they've then associated with the program. And you'd also have to, you know, project that into an annual loan payment. That's not really that hard to do. Right? It's not really that hard to do. The little desk guide we put out in our first presentation in this series is all about how to project those numbers. And that's the kind of thing that if you have the time and resources or your numbers are bad enough that you feel like you really need to make a go at it, you could run all of those traps to see if there's anything there that you could challenge with regard to the debt information that they've provided. What's the timing for a loan debt challenge? So you've got 45 days after the department provides the draft DE rates. So they're probably much like they do the draft cohort default rates through the SAIG mailbox. You know, they'll release the rates. There'll be an electronic announcement. Today we released the draft rates for everybody. And then you've got 45 days to provide evidence showing that the loan debt information used by the department to calculate loan debt for your program is wrong. After the 45-day period expires, you no longer have an opportunity to make this challenge. So it's, again, one of those things where you want to make sure you are ready to look at that data as soon as it comes through the door. What results from a loan debt challenge? Well, again, what you would expect. The department will consider the evidence, and they'll let you know whether they accept or reject the challenge. If they accept it, then they will use the corrected data. Once more, if they use the corrected data, it's not clear that that means that that corrected information will flow in NSLDS and all the subsequent calculations, and you may have an obligation to help make that happen. The department will inform you of the final DE rates by issuing a, quote, notice of determination. After the notice of determination is distributed, the department is cleared to publish the final rates. I make this point, you know, we're about to talk in a minute here next about alternative earnings appeals. And those appeals can be made, if you'll recall from our earlier slide, even after the final rates are published. But I wanted to note that, you know, the only clearance the department needs, once they calculate and distribute the final rates, they can publish those final rates, right, and put them out on their external, on the department's external website, even if you've still got a challenge. And I'll mention here in a subsequent slide, if you do have a challenge going, now any loan debt challenge has to be resolved before the final rates are released, right? But if you've still got an alternative earnings appeal on the books with the department, then and they do decide to publish the final rates, then they say, under the law, they say they will put an asterisk next to the rates when they're put out there sort of in the public domain. And we'll note that that means that there's an alternative earnings appeal. So let's talk about alternative earnings appeals. What is it? When the department issues the draft rates, they will give everybody the mean and median earnings for the cohort. Now, I want to be clear, you're not going to get the earnings for each individual person for each individual student in your cohort. You will get debt information for each individual student, but you will only get earnings information, the mean and median earnings, for the whole cohort. Why? Because the department doesn't have, at least ostensibly. The department doesn't have the earnings for each individual student. Remember, they take that completers list, that's the list of students in your cohort after it's finalized, and they send it over to Social Security Administration, and they're going to send them the student's name, date of birth, and Social Security number. And then the department's going to match those 3 points. They're going to put together the list. They're going to pull the earnings for those individuals, and the Social Security Administration is the one that's going to calculate the mean and the median. And then under the law, the only thing SSA is supposed to send back to the department is the mean and the median for the whole cohort. So that's the only thing the department will have that they can send to you. I don't mean to sound naive, but that, you know, if you are a conspiracy theorist, maybe that means you think the department will actually have that individual data. But under the law, that's not the way it's supposed to work. And for pretty significant privacy reasons, that was the way it was designed. If it were to turn out that it wasn't working that way, the department would be opened up to some pretty significant lawsuits and other concerns. So my expectation is that is the way it will in fact work. But I will leave to the conspiracy theorists to think otherwise. The institution can challenge that earnings component. So when you get that mean and median, if it looks wrong or if it puts you in the zone or failing, you will have an opportunity to challenge. I note if it puts you in the zone or failing, if you're not failing or in the zone, the department's not going to accept an alternative earnings appeal because their feeling is, why should we go through all of this? Your program is passing, right? But if you are failing, and alternative earnings could move you into the zone, or if you are in the zone and an alternative earnings ostensibly could move you into the passing category, then the department will consider the appeal. So where do you get alternative earnings? Because it is what it sounds like. What you're doing is you're saying to the department, hey, we know you got these earnings numbers from Social Security Administration. We think they're wrong, so we're going to provide you alternative earnings data for each one of the students. You can do this in one of two ways that the department will accept. The first is you can get alternative earnings from a state-sponsored data system, or you can pull alternative earnings through an institutional survey using the department's recent graduates employment and earnings survey standards and survey form, or RG's standard and survey form. Again, let's all agree to say RG's. That's going to be the cool way that we're going to say this. Data must be from the correct calendar year. So you can't go out and get alternative earnings information for 2015 and try to use that to challenge your first round rates, because for the first round rates, the department is using earnings information for each individual from calendar year 2014. So if you get alternative earnings information, it's got to be for the right calendar year. Okay, so what's a state-sponsored data system and where do I find one? Well, unfortunately, when the department put out the regs, they didn't bother, or they were unable to, I should say, to identify a single state that has readily available alternative earnings. That doesn't mean there's no one out there, but the department didn't point to anyone. You know, I've had conversations with various people. I understand that there are a lot of states that potentially gather earnings information, right? I mean, because they're doing their own state taxes and that kind of thing. But whether and to what extent that information is publicly available and you would be able to access it is an open question. I will be very frank that I am not optimistic at this moment that there are a lot of opportunities. Now, in years to come, particularly if gainful employment sticks around, I think there is opportunity for state associations of private nonprofit, public schools, et cetera, that have an interest here in alternative earnings, for national associations, higher ed associations, and others, and maybe vendors that are enterprising, to try to put pressure on states to organize and make this data available in a way that post-secondary institutions trying to get alternative earnings information can access it. But even if you do that, there are going to be challenges here. Now, for a start, I will say one thing the department is allowing is you only have to get alternative earnings for 50% of the students in the cohort. So you don't have to come up with alternative earnings for 100%. But even that 50% could be a challenge, and here are just some of the reasons why. I mean, first of all, data regarding individual graduate earnings may be considered private. So you may be able to get your hands on aggregated data. You know, cosmetology graduates in this state in 2014 made X. I mean, that's pretty readily available. But getting your hands on, you know, what Jane Doe made in calendar year 14 could be a much greater challenge. even if the state says, yeah, we'll make it available, then there's a question of, is it maintained in a form that can be correlated with the graduate population? So let's say they say, yeah, we keep individual data, but we don't have any way to determine what they made specifically for calendar year 14, or we don't have any way to break it down to the individual. We can do it at the county level. We can do it, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you got to be able to come up with what Jane Doe made in calendar year 14. That's a pretty specific ask. The other problem is you may have graduates who work in lots of different states, especially if you're in, and I always use Memphis as my example. You know, you may have graduates that are there in Tennessee, but you also may have a number of graduates that go to Arkansas, that go to Mississippi, that drive up to over to Missouri or up to Illinois. You know, all are pretty close to Memphis. And if that's the case, to come up with that 50%, you may have to go to all 5 of those states. Right? And even if 1 or 2 are able to provide you with the data, you may not be able to get to the 50% mark, right? So there are just a lot of problems that make the state data system model a challenge. I don't want to dissuade folks. For many of you, it may work well. You may be in a state that's got it, and you may have graduates that are all local and within that state, and this may be a good alternative for you. If you think you might fit that profile, I'd start looking into this right away, because the other option, conducting the survey for various reasons, also can be a real challenge. So how do I conduct a graduate survey? The National Center for Education Statistics, I say, is developing here. It's pretty much done, although it's not official yet, but there have been 2 rounds of comments, et cetera. And it's all out there. It's been developed and put up for comment. It just hasn't been, you know, sort of officially rubber stamped. They created this RG standards and survey form. So they literally created a survey, right, that asks some specific questions. And then they also have come up with a whole set of parameters around which that speak to how the survey must be conducted and how the results must be interpreted and whether or not they are considered statistically valid, right? So if you want to do this, you're going to have to make sure this isn't just a matter of you managing to get some of your graduates on the horn and get something from them. Hey, what do you think you made in calendar year 14? This has to be done in a very specific way. The department is creating an online platform that I like to call the Department Survey Monkey, right, that you can use to manage these surveys. And frankly, and supposedly this platform will embed all these various requirements relating to how it's supposed to be conducted and the interpreting of the results, et cetera. Frankly, if the department's platform is decent, I would certainly recommend using it, right? Because if you use their platform, then you are essentially guaranteed that you're conducting the survey in a way that they consider to be valid and within the parameters of the RG standards. You don't have to use their platform, but if you determine to go another direction, that means that you've got to take the initiative of learning all the standards and the requirements for a statistically valid survey instrument, and then you've got to create it, and you've got to be able to prove to the department when you submit the information that it was all done correctly. So an appeal submission, also, this is a pretty decent package. If you decide to submit an alternative earnings appeal, you have to actually have the survey results and supporting documentation. It's got to have a CEO certification attesting that the survey was conducted, again, in accordance with those standards, and you have to have an examination level attestation engagement report from an independent CPA. So this is not a lightweight submission to the department. This is a pretty significant submission. Also, just a couple of these parameters. So the survey has to be administered to every student on the final completers list. It doesn't mean they all have to answer, but you have to figure out a way to administer it to everyone. This is another reason among many that I'm encouraging schools. One of the things we talked about in our strategy session that schools can start doing now is considering how they can condition their graduates to stay in better touch, right? Whatever your mechanism is now for making sure that you have current and valid contact information for graduates, if you don't have it for 100%, then there's room to improve. Right? So you want to think about, can we have a conversation with students when they graduate? Is there some sort of alumni outreach program we can put into place? I mean, is there anything we can do to increase the likelihood that we will have valid contact information for all the graduates in a particular cohort? Because we want to make sure we can distribute this alternative earnings survey to everyone. At least 50% of the graduates surveyed have to submit a completed survey for the data to be used to support an appeal. And a completed survey means it includes sufficient responses to calculate the graduate's earnings, including zero earnings. Incidentally, the survey itself that the department has come up with only has about 5 questions on it. I mean, it's not complicated, right? It's not complicated. So if they basically give you their respond and give you their name, et cetera, and their earnings information, you ought to get pretty close to having a completed survey for purposes of counting towards that 50%. The bigger challenge in my mind, even assuming you've got all of them and you can distribute and you can get a bunch to respond, the bigger challenge is whether or not you can satisfy the department's non-response bias criteria. So basically what this means is the department is saying, look, when it comes to this type of survey and earnings information, we think that there are 3 data points that can impact whether or not the survey is valid or not, and that's whether the individual got a Pell Grant, whether they had a 0 EFC, and their gender, right? And what they've basically are saying is if people have Pell Grants, if they have 0 EFC, or if they are women, they are likely to make less money. So if a disproportionate number of the folks who respond to your survey don't fit into any of these categories, for example, if you've got folks who fit in all 3, let's say you've got in your completing class, in your cohort, about 50% have meet these 3 criteria and about 50% don't. If the only people that respond to your survey are men that had no Pell Grant, you know, and something other than a 0 EFC, then what the department's basically saying is, well, those folks are all likely to be making more in the way of earnings, so that the survey response doesn't really accurately represent the earnings that the folks in the entire cohort are making on a regular basis, right? So the salient point here is that even if you get responses from 50, 60, 70, 80%, right, the group of people, at least with regard to these 3 criteria, the group of people who respond need to look a lot like the group of people who actually graduated from your program, okay? The good news is if you have a homogeneous class, right, and you have a homogeneous group of graduates, and what I mean by that is, you know, if 99% of the people who graduated from your program are all women, if the vast majority have Pell Grants and the vast majority have 0 EFC, which for some certificate programs at some schools in certain locations, that's the case, then you're not going to have trouble meeting this non-response bias test, right? Because almost anyone who responds is going to more or less look like the overall profile. Similarly, if your whole group is, if 99% of your graduates all are men and none of them have Pell Grants and none of them have 0 EFC, again, the folks who respond are almost certainly going to look more or less like the folks who completed your program. But the problem, the challenge is going to be if you have a diverse student population with regard to these 3 criteria. So if it's 50-50, you know, if about half, you know, fit these criteria and about half don't, then you may have a hard time coming up with a survey response group that looks, in a statistically valid sense, a lot like your group that graduated your class. The threshold here is a 10% variance. So again, this is going to be a challenge. It's going to be one of those things where you're going to want to think about how do I make sure I can get this to everybody, and how do I make sure that the folks responding are a statistically valid representation, right, of the folks who actually graduated from the program. So it's complicated stuff. It's complicated stuff. What is the timing for an alternative earnings appeal? So the window here is a little different. The 45 days is for completers lists and loan debt challenges. When it comes to alternative earnings appeals, you actually have a really wide window potentially, particularly in year 1, I think, because the department's processing is going to be slower, right? So at any point, you can file a notice of intent to appeal. That's not the actual alternative earnings appeal. That's just the thing that says we intend to file one. You can file a notice of intent to appeal as early as the issuance of the draft rates and as late as 14 days following the issuance of the notice of determination. So anywhere, think about that. So anywhere from the day you get the draft rates, right, to 2 weeks following the release of the final rates, you can file a notice saying we're going to provide an alternative earnings appeal. That could be many, many months in between. It's got to be at least a couple of months because you get the draft rates and then you have 45 days to file a loan debt challenge. Everyone's got to let that 45-day period run. Then the department's got to process those loan debt challenges, right? And then after that, they're going to release the final rate. So it's got to be at least a couple of months, and then you got 2 more weeks on top of that. And you can file the actual alternative earnings appeal package as late as 60 days after you get the final rates and that final rate notice of determination. So anywhere from the moment you get the draft rates to 60 days following the final rates, you can submit that alternative earnings appeal package. And my expectation is that will be total a period of 4 or 5 or even 6 months, particularly in year 1. But I would not waste a day because, as we've already discussed, the requirements for filing an accurate alternative earnings appeal package are significant. By the way, I have not seen anything yet, and I will go back and double check here and in the months to come make sure I'm looking hard at the department's guidance, but I've not seen anything yet that suggests that if you were to conduct this survey, right, once, and you didn't get results that were statistically valid, but you still had several months before the deadline, that you couldn't try to do it a second time. So another advantage of trying early, I mean, at some point you're going to annoy graduates, but if you start early, there at least would seem to be the possibility that you could conduct the survey multiple times, right, or in multiple waves, and then after you got all the responses, you could package them, get your independent auditor to certify them, and then you send them off to the department. It doesn't even suggest to me that they, like I say, have to be done in a single round. So let's say you did round 1 and you got some responses, then you could do this exact same survey, but then you get more contact information and you send it out to more people and you continue to collect additional responses, right? So it's not as if you get one shot to send it out. I've seen nothing that suggests that, and it means that people who start early are going to have another decided advantage. What results for an alternative earnings appeal? If the department denies the appeal, then they'll provide notice to the institution to explain the basis for the denial. If they affirm the appeal, then likewise they'll notify you and then they'll publish updated final rates. And that speaks again to the fact that they could have already published final rates with an asterisk. Institutions, importantly, are not subject to any sanctions relating to the debt to earning rates while an appeal is pending. And if you have final DE rates published, like I said, it will include this asterisk. I say asterisk, I mean it could be another form of annotation, but I believe that is what they said they would use. There is a little bit of guidance on the alternative earnings appeals. I would take this all with a significant grain of salt. In an interesting twist, in August of last year, the department actually published a draft best practices guide for conducting the survey. Keep in mind that this was well before NCES had gone through its 2 rounds of comments and even put the survey instrument out there, and even now the survey instrument has not been finalized. So this is posted to the department's Gainful Employment website right now, but it is a draft and could change. I think it's useful to give you a sense of what these things are going to look at, but again, take it with a grain of salt. The other thing you can do in November, the last and most recent version of the proposed form and standards was actually posted up for comment. And if you click on this link in the PDF, it'll take you to that page. And so you can actually see the survey questions and also all the statistical parameters that have to be satisfied. Alternative earnings appeal, when will the RG's form and alternative earnings appeal process be finalized? Background materials suggested a target date of December 2015. Obviously that has been missed. So at this point, we're still waiting. DE rate challenges timeline. So this is just a little graphic I put together to try to give you a sense of how all the challenges work together. So it moves left to right chronologically, and the green represents the completers list sort of timeline, the pink is the debt challenge timeline, and the light blue at the bottom is alternative earnings appeals. And this hopefully gives you a sense of how they all relate. So if you start on the far left, spring of 2016, although again, this I'll get backed up, but spring of 2016, you have the issuance of the draft completers list, and you have 45 days to file that completers list challenge. The department accepts or rejects the challenge. Then you have the issuance of the final completers list, right? Then at some point after that, after they've crunched those numbers, they finalize the list, they send the list to the SSA, they get all that data back, they come up with their draft rates, which again could be a period of many weeks or even a couple, 3 months. Then they're going to issue the draft DE rates, and that triggers when the draft DE rates come out. If you go down there, you can see at that point you've got 45 days to file your loan debt challenge, and that is the earliest date to file a notice of earnings appeal. So in other words, to tell the department, hey, we're going to file an alternative earnings appeal. Presumably, too, at any point from then on, you could file your alternative earnings appeal up to the deadline, right? After the issuance of the draft DE rates and the loan debt challenges run their course and the department crunches all the numbers, at some point we say right now early 2017, you would have the issuance of the final DE rates and a notice of determination. That also is the point at which the department is authorized to publish the final rates. And if you go down, you could see on the loan debt row, essentially when the final rates come out, that's when you know what the results of your loan debt challenge. But you still have at that point 14 days to just file a notice that you want to provide an alternative earnings appeal, and still 60 days to actually file the whole thing. But remember, I mean, you've got to run that survey, you've got to get all those responses in if you're going to use the survey as opposed to state data. You know, you have to get all the responses in, you got to get an independent auditor to certify those results, right? That's a lot to do in 2 months. So, you know, what you're really going to want to do is as soon as those draft rates come out, you're going to want to make a call as to whether or not you're going to try to do an alternative earnings appeal. Finally, GE resources. So the top line here is that's the IFAP Gainful Employment Information page. Lots of stuff on that page. And then below it, I just sort of articulate the things that are on that page: Federal Register notices, dear colleague letters, and electronic announcements, frequently asked questions, webinars and presentations, and various resource materials. And again, these are all active links. This webinar series, so if you're serious about gainful employment, you're trying to get up on this stuff, if you're the person at your institution tasked with this mess, then please, I welcome you to listen to, we've probably got about 6 hours of audio content here, and then all the accompanying presentations plus the desk guide. Also, we have our higher education law and policy blog, Regucation, where we periodically write about gainful employment. So, and lots of other issues, FERPA, Title IX, et cetera. But that's probably worth keeping an eye on as well if you're one of the folks who's trying to, again, manage all of this for your institution. Oh, and here's a picture of the desk guide, and the desk guide, a current PDF version is also on the page where these audio recordings are available. So hopefully if you're listening to this, it should be right in your line of sight. This is my information. Again, I'm Aaron Lacey here in the higher ed practice at Thompson Coburn LLP. Very much appreciate folks listening in. We hope this has been helpful. And if you have questions or need some assistance, certainly feel free to give us a call. Otherwise, have a great day, and we look forward to connecting later.